The axe fell with a sickening thud, splitting wood and bone with equal brutality. In the pre-dawn darkness of New Year's Eve 1884, Austin, Texas would witness savagery that would earn its perpetrator a name whispered in terror for generations: the Servant Girl Annihilator. But this story doesn't begin with that final, horrific night. It begins 4 years earlier, in a frontier town where gas lamps flickered against an endless darkness, and where the line between civilization and chaos was razor-thin. The year was 1880, and Austin was a city caught between two worlds. The Wild West was dying, but it hadn't died quietly. Electric lights had just arrived, casting harsh shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent life. Telegraph wires stretched across a sky that had once belonged solely to hawks and buzzards. The railroad had brought prosperity, but it had also brought strangers, drifters, criminals, and predators who could disappear as quickly as they arrived. In this rapidly changing landscape, domestic servants formed the backbone of respectable society. These women, many of them freed slaves trying to build new lives in post-Civil War Texas, worked in the homes of Austin's growing merchant class. They cooked, cleaned, and cared for families, often living in small quarters behind the main houses, vulnerable and isolated when darkness fell. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. Nobody could have predicted that these hardworking women would become the targets of a killer whose methods would be so brutal, so calculated, that newspapers would struggle to find words adequate to describe the carnage. The man who would stalk Austin streets possessed an intelligence that made him all the more terrifying. He studied his victims, learned their routines, and struck with surgical precision. The first whispers of something wrong began in late 1884, when servant girls started reporting strange encounters, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, the feeling of being watched, unexplained sounds in the night. But whispers from servant girls didn't carry much weight in 1880s Austin. These women existed on society's margins, their fears dismissed as superstition or hysteria. How tragically wrong Austin's establishment would prove to be. The predator moving through their city wasn't interested in the wealthy families sleeping safely in their main houses. His appetite was for the vulnerable, the overlooked, the forgotten. And on a cold December night in 1884, when most of Austin was preparing for Christmas celebrations, he would claim his first victim in a manner so savage that it would haunt the city for decades. The weapon of choice would be an axe, not the clean, quick strike of an executioner, but the frenzied blows of someone who found pleasure in the act itself. Blood would paint the walls of servant quarters across Austin, and with each attack, the killer would grow bolder, more confident, more creative in his methods of terror. This is the story of how one man's darkness consumed an entire city, how fear became a living thing that stalked Austin's streets alongside the killer himself. It's the story of investigators who found themselves chasing shadows, of a community that turned against itself in paranoid fury, and of victims whose names have been largely forgotten by history, despite the horror they endured. The Servant Girl Annihilator would claim at least 8 lives, possibly more. His reign of terror would span over a year, paralyzing Austin and attracting national attention. Newspapers as far away as London would report on the savage murders plaguing the Texas capital. And when the killing finally stopped, it would leave behind more questions than answers, more legends than facts. Tonight, we peel back the layers of time to examine one of America's first documented serial killers, a predator whose identity remains unknown but whose methods would influence criminal investigations for generations to come. Austin, Texas in 1884 was a city desperately trying to shed its frontier skin. With a population just over 11,000, it perched precariously between the untamed wilderness of its past and the civilized future it desperately wanted to claim. The Colorado River wound through the heart of the city like a dark ribbon, its waters reflecting the gas lamps that had only recently begun to push back the oppressive Texas darkness. The city's layout told the story of its divided nature. Wealthy merchants and politicians lived in grand homes north of the river, their properties sprawling across manicured lots with servant quarters tucked discreetly behind the main houses. These were the homes of men who had made fortunes in cattle, cotton, and commerce. Men whose wives needed domestic help to maintain their social standing in Austin's rapidly developing high society. South of the river lay a different world entirely. Here, in an area known as Clarksville, lived Austin's black community, former slaves who had gained their freedom but found it came without the security they'd hoped for. Many of the women from this community worked as domestic servants in the grand houses across the river, walking the dark streets each evening to return to their own modest homes and families. The contrast between these two worlds was stark and deliberate. While the wealthy areas boasted some of the first electric streetlights west of the Mississippi, Clarksville remained largely in darkness after sunset. The few gas lamps that existed there burned dimly, creating pools of weak yellow light separated by vast stretches of impenetrable shadow. Into this divided landscape came people from across the country and beyond. The railroad had made Austin a hub of commerce and transportation, bringing legitimate businessmen and dangerous drifters in equal measure. Hotel registers from the period read like a roll call of American mobility. Traveling salesmen from Chicago, ranchers from West Texas, gamblers from New Orleans, and countless others whose true names and intentions remain mysteries. Among Austin's growing population were the domestic servants who would soon become targets. These women lived lives of careful routine, walking the same paths each day between their employers' homes and their own neighborhoods. They knew which streets were safest after dark, which shortcuts to avoid, and which areas of town harbored the most danger. What they couldn't know was that someone was watching them, learning these routines, mapping their movements with the patience of a hunter studying prey. The killer who would soon earn the name Servant Girl Annihilator understood Austin's geography of vulnerability better than the police who would eventually hunt him. The city's law enforcement in 1884 was hardly equipped to handle a sophisticated criminal. Austin's police force consisted of fewer than a dozen men, led by Marshal Grooms Lee, a veteran lawman who had experience with cattle rustlers and bar fights, but nothing like the systematic terror that was about to unfold. The department had no detective division, no scientific methods of investigation, and no experience with crimes that crossed racial and social boundaries. This lack of preparedness would prove catastrophic when the killing began. The police would find themselves not just investigating murders, but trying to hold together a community that was rapidly fracturing along lines of race, class, and fear. As the body count mounted, Austin's carefully maintained social order would begin to crumble, revealing the raw prejudices and paranoid suspicions that lay just beneath the surface of frontier civility. The servant girls themselves lived in a world of particular vulnerability. They possessed intimate knowledge of wealthy families' routines and possessions, making them valuable to criminals seeking inside information. Yet their low social status meant their concerns were often dismissed or ignored. When they reported feeling watched or threatened, their employers and the police alike were quick to attribute such fears to superstition or imagination. This combination of factors, social invisibility, predictable routines, and systematic dismissal of their concerns, would make Austin's servant girls perfect victims for a predator who understood how to exploit society's blind spots. The man stalking Austin's streets had chosen his hunting ground well. He had identified prey that was accessible, vulnerable, and whose disappearance would initially cause little alarm among those with the power to stop him. As 1884 drew to a close, Austin buzzed with anticipation for the coming year. The city was growing, prospering, and modernizing at a pace that thrilled its boosters and business leaders. Electric lights were spreading, new buildings were rising, and the future seemed bright with promise. None of them could have imagined that in just a few weeks, their city would become synonymous with a kind of horror that would make headlines across the nation and cast a shadow that would linger for generations. December 30th, 1884. The name Molly Smith would have been forgotten by history, lost among the thousands of domestic servants who labored in obscurity throughout the American South. Instead, Her brutal murder would mark the beginning of Austen's descent into terror and earn her the tragic distinction of being the Servant Girl Annihilator's first known victim. Molly worked for William Hall, a respected merchant whose comfortable home sat in one of Austen's better neighborhoods. Like most domestic servants of her era, she lived in quarters behind the main house, a small, modest structure that provided privacy for the family while keeping their help conveniently close. It was an arrangement that had worked safely for years, until the night when safety became an illusion in Austin, Texas. The attack came in the darkest hours before dawn, when the city lay wrapped in winter silence. Molly's small cabin sat perhaps 50 feet from the main house, close enough that the Halls might have heard screams had she been given the chance to make any. The killer had studied his target well. He knew the layout of the property, the family's sleeping patterns, and most importantly, the isolation of Molly's quarters. What happened next would establish a pattern of savagery that would terrorize Austen for over a year. The killer didn't simply murder Molly Smith. He destroyed her with a ferocity that spoke to something far darker than robbery or even ordinary homicide. Using what investigators would later determine was likely an axe, he struck her repeatedly, with a violence that went far beyond what was necessary to kill. But the weapon alone didn't define the horror of what had been done to Molly. The killer had also brought a second implement, a long, thin rod of iron that he drove through her ear and into her brain. This wasn't the desperate improvisation of a panicked criminal. This was deliberate, calculated brutality that suggested either extensive anatomical knowledge or previous practice in the art of human destruction. When William Hall discovered Molly's body the next morning, the scene that greeted him defied comprehension. The walls of the small cabin were painted with blood. Molly's skull had been split open with such force that fragments of bone were embedded in the wooden walls. The iron rod protruded from her head like some grotesque antenna, a calling card left by a killer who wanted his work to be remembered. The immediate response revealed much about Austen's social hierarchy and racial attitudes in 1884. While the murder was shocking, it was also, in the minds of many white residents, somewhat contained. A black servant girl had been killed. Tragic, certainly, but not necessarily indicative of broader danger to the community's respectable families. The assumption, spoken and unspoken, was that this was likely a crime of passion within Austen's black community, a domestic dispute gone horribly wrong. Marshal Grooms Lee and his small police force conducted what passed for an investigation in Frontier, Texas. They questioned residents of Clarksville, looked for suspicious characters, and made the kinds of assumptions that would prove tragically wrong in the months to come. The murder weapon was never found, despite extensive searches. No witnesses came forward, though in truth, few people would have been moving through Austin streets at that hour. What the police failed to recognize was the sophisticated planning that had gone into Molly's murder. The killer had approached her cabin without alerting the family sleeping nearby. He had brought two different weapons, suggesting premeditation and preparation. Most ominously, he had chosen a victim whose death would generate relatively little sustained attention from authorities, giving him time to plan his next move. The method of murder itself would prove significant as investigators eventually began to recognize patterns. The combination of blunt force trauma and penetrative violence would become the killer's signature. The iron rod through the ear was particularly telling. It suggested either medical knowledge or experience with slaughtering animals, pointing toward someone with specialized skills rather than a common street criminal. In the days following Molly's murder, Austin's black community began to whisper about safety, about the wisdom of working alone in isolated quarters, about the vulnerability of women who move through the city's darker neighborhoods. These conversations took place quietly, carefully, among people who understood that expressing too much concern might be seen as stirring up trouble. The white community, meanwhile, had already begun to move on. Molly Smith's death was filed away as an unfortunate incident, a reminder that crime existed in their growing city, but not necessarily a threat to their own safety. The newspapers gave the murder modest coverage, treating it as a local tragedy rather than the opening chapter of a much larger horror story. How wrong they all were. The man who had killed Molly Smith was just getting started. He had tested his methods, confirmed his ability to strike without being caught, and identified a class of victims whose deaths would not immediately galvanize the community against him. In the shadows of Austin's divided society, a predator had found his perfect hunting ground. The servant girls of Austin were now living on borrowed time, though few of them yet realized it. The killing didn't stop with Molly Smith. It accelerated. Exactly 1 week after Molly's brutal murder, on January 6, 1885, Austin awoke to discover that the horror had returned. And this time, it had claimed not one victim, but two. The bodies of Eliza Shelley and her boyfriend, known only as William, were found in Eliza's servant quarters behind the home of L.B. Johnson. The scene that greeted investigators made Molly Smith's murder seem almost restrained by comparison. Eliza had been subjected to the same signature brutality, her skull crushed by repeated axe blows, an iron rod driven through her ear into her brain. But William's presence had added a new dimension to the killer's methods. The young man had been beaten to death with savage efficiency, his head caved in by what appeared to be the same axe that had killed his girlfriend. The killer had moved through the small cabin like a force of nature, destroying everything in his path with methodical precision. What chilled investigators most was the evidence of the killer's composure during the attack. Despite having 2 victims to subdue, he had maintained his signature methods, taking the time to drive the iron rod through Eliza's skull even after killing William. This wasn't a crime of passion or panic. It was the work of someone who took pleasure in the act itself, someone for whom murder had become a form of artistic expression. The double murder sent shockwaves through Austin's servant community. Word spread quickly through Clarksville and the other neighborhoods where domestic workers lived. The killer was hunting them specifically, and he was growing bolder. Women who had walked alone through Austin streets for years suddenly found themselves looking over their shoulders, jumping at shadows, making arrangements to travel in groups whenever possible. But fear wasn't confined to Austin's black community. The white establishment began to realize that their comfortable assumptions about contained violence were crumbling. The killer had now struck twice in respectable neighborhoods, on properties belonging to established families. While the victims were servants, the proximity of the violence to Austin's elite made it impossible to dismiss as someone else's problem. Marshal Grooms, Lee found himself under increasing pressure to solve what newspapers were beginning to call the servant girl murders. His small police force was overwhelmed, lacking both the resources and expertise to investigate such sophisticated crimes. Lee had dealt with cattle thieves and saloon brawls, but this systematic terror was beyond his experience or training. The investigation revealed disturbing patterns that suggested the killer possessed intimate knowledge of Austin's geography and social structure. He knew which properties had isolated servant quarters, which families kept irregular schedules, and which routes offered the best opportunities for approach and escape. This wasn't a stranger passing through town. This was someone who had studied Austin's vulnerabilities with the patience of a scholar. Even more unsettling was the killer's apparent ability to move through the city undetected. Austin in 1885 was still small enough that strangers were noticed, yet no one reported seeing suspicious figures near the murder scenes. The killer either lived in Austin or possessed an almost supernatural ability to blend into his surroundings. He left no witnesses, no clear physical evidence, and no obvious motive beyond the violence itself. The weapon choices continued to puzzle investigators. The axe suggested someone comfortable with tools, possibly a laborer or farmer. But the iron rods were more specific. They appeared to be sharpened railroad spikes or similar industrial implements. This combination suggested someone with access to both common tools and specialized materials, narrowing the field of suspects while simultaneously making the killer seem more dangerous and unpredictable. As word of the double murder spread, Austin's social fabric began to strain under the weight of collective fear and suspicion. Servants became reluctant to work late or live alone. Families found themselves suspicious of employees they had trusted for years. The easy racial assumptions that had initially characterized the investigation gave way to a more paranoid reality. If the killer could strike at will in respectable neighborhoods, no one was truly safe. The press coverage intensified dramatically after the January 6th murders. What had been treated as isolated incidents now commanded front-page attention. The Austin Daily Statesman began referring to the fiend stalking the city's streets. Papers as far away as San Antonio and Dallas picked up the story, spreading word of Austin's terror beyond the city limits. But media attention brought little comfort to Austin's servant community. If anything, the publicity seemed to energize the killer. The murders had been committed with increasing boldness, and the time between attacks was shortening. Molly Smith had died on December 30th. Eliza Shelley and William had been killed just 7 days later. The mathematics of terror were becoming clear. The Servant Girl Annihilator was accelerating his timeline, growing more confident with each successful attack. Austin's police force was chasing shadows while the killer moved freely through their city, selecting his next victims from a pool of vulnerable women who had no choice but to continue their daily routines despite the growing danger. In the servant quarters scattered throughout Austin, women lay awake at night, listening for footsteps, wondering if they would be next. The killer had made it clear that he preferred his victims alive and terrified before the axe fell. As winter deepened in 1885, so did Austin's descent into a nightmare from which there seemed no escape. Christmas Eve, 1885. While Austin's families gathered around candlelit tables and decorated trees, preparing for the season's most sacred celebration, evil was stalking through the darkness with an appetite for destruction that would make the holiday forever synonymous with horror in the city's collective memory. The killer had learned from his previous attacks. Nearly a year had passed since the January murders of Eliza Shelley and William, a gap that had allowed Austin's terror to fade into uneasy vigilance. Many residents had begun to hope that the monster had moved on, died, or been captured elsewhere. The servant girls still took precautions, but the sharp edge of fear had dulled with time and the human need to believe in safety. They were tragically wrong. The Servant Girl Annihilator hadn't disappeared. He had been watching, planning, and preparing for what would become his most audacious and brutal night yet. The first victim was Irene Cross, a cook who worked for the Hancock family. Irene lived in the familiar arrangement, a small cabin behind her employer's main house, isolated enough to provide privacy, but close enough for convenience. She had survived nearly a year of Austin's reign of terror, had taken all the precautions that seemed reasonable, and had begun to believe that perhaps the worst was behind them all. The killer approached Irene's cabin sometime after midnight, when the city lay wrapped in the peaceful silence of Christmas Eve. He had studied her routine, knew her habits, and understood exactly how to approach without alerting the family sleeping in the main house. What happened next would establish new depths of savagery that shocked even investigators who thought they had seen the worst of human evil. Irene didn't die quickly. The killer had brought his signature weapons, the axe and the sharpened iron rod. But this time he employed them with a deliberate cruelty that suggested he was savoring the process. Her skull was split open with multiple blows, each delivered with surgical precision to maximize suffering while preventing quick death. The iron rod was driven through her head, but not immediately. Investigators would later determine that she had lived through the initial assault, conscious and aware during the final moments of horror. But the killer wasn't finished with Christmas Eve. Having successfully murdered Irene Cross without raising alarm, he moved through Austin streets to claim a second victim. Lucinda Body, a domestic servant for the Phillips family, became the night's second casualty in what investigators would later realize was a coordinated assault on the city's sense of safety. Lucinda's murder followed the same grotesque pattern, but with refinements that spoke to the killer's evolving methods. The axe work was more precise, the placement of the iron rod more deliberate. The killer was perfecting his technique, treating each murder as an opportunity to improve his craft. The scene suggested someone who took professional pride in his work, who viewed human destruction as an art form requiring constant refinement. The discovery of 2 more bodies on Christmas morning sent Austin into unprecedented panic. The timing seemed deliberately chosen to maximize psychological impact. What should have been the year's most joyful day became a nightmare that would haunt the city for generations. Children who should have been playing with new toys instead heard their parents whispering in hushed, terrified tones about the monster who had turned Christmas Eve into a charnel house. Marshall Grooms, Lee found himself facing not just a criminal investigation, but a community in complete psychological collapse. The year-long gap between murders had convinced many that the danger had passed, making the Christmas Eve horror even more devastating. The killer had demonstrated that he could strike at will, that no amount of time or precaution could provide real safety, and that Austin's most sacred celebrations were not immune to his appetite for destruction. The investigation revealed disturbing new details about the killer's methods and mindset. He had chosen Christmas Eve deliberately, understanding the psychological impact of defiling the holiday. The precision of the murders suggested extensive practice, either on previous unknown victims or through other forms of violence. Most chilling of all was evidence that he had spent considerable time at each crime scene, lingering over his work with the leisure of someone who felt completely secure in his environment. The weapon analysis continued to perplex investigators. The axes used in all the murders appeared to be different tools, suggesting the killer either owned multiple axes or was acquiring them specifically for his crimes. The iron rods were more consistent, railroad spikes that had been sharpened to deadly points, indicating access to industrial materials and the tools necessary to modify them. Austin's white community could no longer maintain the comfortable fiction that this was contained violence within the black community. The killer had now claimed at least 6 victims, always using the same methods, always targeting servant girls, always managing to escape without leaving useful evidence. The pattern was undeniable, and the implications were terrifying. Austin was home to a calculating predator who could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. The Christmas Eve murders marked a turning point in Austin's response to the terror. What had been whispered fears became open panic. What had been racial assumptions became community-wide dread. The Servant Girl Annihilator had succeeded in transforming Austin from a growing, confident city into a place where darkness held genuine menace, and every shadow might conceal a killer whose appetite for destruction seemed boundless. As 1885 drew to a close, Austin faced a horrible reality. Their city had become home to one of America's first documented serial killers, and he was just getting started. By early 1886, Austin's police force was drowning in evidence that pointed everywhere and nowhere. Marshall Grooms Lee spread the contents of 6 brutal murders across his desk like pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a coherent picture. Yet within the chaos of blood and terror, patterns were emerging, patterns that would help investigators understand their quarry even as he continued to elude capture. The killer's geographical knowledge had become impossible to ignore. Every attack had occurred in areas where the perpetrator could approach unseen and escape undetected. He understood Austin's layout with the precision of someone who had either lived there for years or had conducted extensive reconnaissance. The servant quarters he targeted were invariably isolated enough to muffle screams, but close enough to respectable neighborhoods that his presence wouldn't automatically raise suspicion. More disturbing was the killer's apparent understanding of his victims' routines. Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Lucinda Body, all had been attacked during windows when they were most vulnerable and least likely to be discovered quickly. This suggested surveillance, patience, and a systematic approach that elevated the crimes from random violence to calculated hunting. The weapon analysis revealed a killer who was both consistent and adaptive. The signature iron rods were always railroad spikes, sharpened to lethal points with tools that suggested metalworking skills. But the axes varied, indicating either a collection of implements or the ability to acquire new weapons as needed. This combination of consistency and variation pointed towards someone with both specialized knowledge and broad practical skills. Dr. Charles Steiner, one of Austin's few physicians with experience in violent death, provided analysis that chilled investigators to their core. The killer's use of the iron rods wasn't random brutality. It demonstrated sophisticated anatomical knowledge. The rods were invariably driven through the ear canal at precise angles that would penetrate the brain while avoiding the skull's thickest sections. This suggested either medical training or extensive experience with animal slaughter. Even more unsettling was Dr. Steiner's observation about the killer's timing and methodology. The victims showed evidence of having been conscious during the initial attacks, suggesting the killer deliberately avoided immediately fatal blows. He wanted his victims alive and aware during their final moments, a sadistic refinement that spoke to psychological depths that investigators were only beginning to fathom. The investigation had also revealed the killer's remarkable ability to avoid detection despite the increased patrols and vigilance following each attack. Austin's small size should have worked against a serial predator, yet he moved through the city like smoke, leaving death in his wake while remaining invisible to hundreds of pairs of increasingly watchful eyes. Marshal Lee had begun consulting with investigators from larger cities, seeking advice from lawmen who had dealt with similar cases. What he learned was deeply unsettling. There were no similar cases. The combination of systematic targeting, signature methodology, and sustained evasion was unprecedented in American criminal history. Austin was dealing with something new and terrible, a killer whose methods would later be recognized as the template for serial murder. The racial dynamics of the crimes had initially led investigators down false paths, but patterns were beginning to suggest something more complex and disturbing. All victims were black women working as domestic servants, but the killer's approach suggested this wasn't racially motivated violence in the traditional sense. Rather, he had identified a class of victims whose deaths would initially generate less intensive investigation, buying him time to perfect his methods and establish his reign of terror. The psychological profile that emerged from the evidence painted a picture of a killer unlike anything Austin's lawmen had encountered. He was patient, methodical, and possessed of considerable intelligence. He understood human behavior well enough to predict his victims' movements and police responses. Most chillingly, he appeared to view murder not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself, an art form requiring constant refinement and increasingly bold expression. The gaps between attacks revealed another disturbing pattern. The killer didn't strike from desperate need or uncontrolled impulse. He attacked when conditions were optimal, when he was prepared, and when the psychological impact would be maximized. The Christmas Eve murders had demonstrated his understanding of symbolism and timing, suggesting a sophisticated mind that found pleasure in the broader terror his actions created. Physical evidence remained frustratingly sparse, but what existed was telling. The killer left crime scenes that were simultaneously chaotic and controlled, violent enough to suggest frenzy, but organized enough to indicate planning. He never left clear fingerprints, never dropped personal items, and never made the kinds of mistakes that typically led to capture. This suggested either extensive criminal experience or natural cunning that made him far more dangerous than typical violent offenders. The investigation had also revealed the killer's intimate knowledge of Austin's social structure. He understood which families kept which schedules, which servants lived alone, and which properties offered the best opportunities for undetected approach. This knowledge could only have been acquired through sustained observation or through a position that provided natural access to information about Austin's domestic arrangements. As winter gave way to spring in 1886, investigators found themselves chasing a ghost who left only corpses and terror in his wake. The patterns they had identified pointed toward a killer of unprecedented sophistication and cruelty, someone who had turned murder into a form of performance art with Austin's servant girls as his unwilling stage. The most frightening pattern of all was the escalation. The gaps between murders were shortening, the violence was intensifying, and the killer's confidence was growing with each successful attack. Austin's investigators were beginning to realize they weren't just hunting a murderer. They were racing against time to stop a predator whose appetite for destruction seemed boundless. Fear has a way of transforming civilized people into something altogether more primitive. By the spring of 1886, Austin's terror had reached a breaking point where rational investigation gave way to mob psychology, and the city's residents began taking justice into their own hands with a fury that often proved more dangerous than the killer they were hunting. The transformation began in the servant quarters and spread outward like wildfire through Austin's social fabric. Black men who worked alongside the targeted women began organizing in formal patrols, walking the streets at night with whatever weapons they could find: axes, hammers, kitchen knives, and the occasional pistol. These men understood that the police couldn't protect their wives, daughters, and sweethearts, and they were prepared to do whatever was necessary to fill that void. But vigilante justice wasn't confined to Austin's black community. White residents, increasingly paranoid about the killer's ability to strike at will in their own neighborhoods, formed their own groups with more resources and deadlier intentions. Armed with rifles and revolvers, these patrols moved through Austin streets with the authority of men who believed they were defending civilization itself against a monster that conventional law enforcement had proven powerless to stop. The inevitable collision between these forces came on a humid night in April 1886. A group of armed white men encountered 3 black workers returning home late from jobs across town. In the darkness and paranoia that had consumed Austin, any black man moving alone became a potential suspect. Words were exchanged, tensions escalated, and within moments the night erupted in gunfire that left 1 man dead and 2 others wounded. The victim was Samuel Washington, a carpenter whose only crime had been walking home from work. He had no connection to the murders, no history of violence, and a family that depended on his wages. But in the fevered atmosphere that gripped Austin, suspicion had become its own form of death sentence. Samuel's killing marked the moment when the city's fear of the Servant Girl Annihilator began destroying innocent lives beyond those the killer claimed directly. Marshal Grooms, Lee found himself fighting a war on multiple fronts. Not only was he still hunting a serial killer who had claimed at least 6 lives, but he was now trying to prevent Austin from tearing itself apart through vigilante violence. His small police force was overwhelmed, caught between demands for protection that they couldn't provide and a community that was increasingly willing to dispense its own brutal justice. The vigilante movements revealed ugly truths about Austin's social structure that the murders had brought to the surface. White patrols operated with virtual impunity, confident that their actions would be viewed as necessary protection of civilized society. Black patrols faced constant harassment and were frequently arrested on weapons charges or suspicion of various crimes. The same terror that united Austin against the killer was also fracturing it along racial lines that would take generations to heal. One of the most disturbing developments was the rise of self-appointed detectives who claimed special insight into the killer's identity and methods. These men, usually with no investigative experience but plenty of theories, began conducting their own interrogations of suspects. Their methods ranged from aggressive questioning to outright torture, and their targets were invariably chosen based on prejudice rather than evidence. The most notorious of these amateur investigators was William Porter, a saloon owner who claimed the killer was a foreign element that had infiltrated Austin's decent society. Porter organized what he called citizen tribunals that subjected dozens of innocent men to interrogations that bordered on lynch mob proceedings. His activities attracted followers who were more interested in violence than justice, turning his investigations into opportunities for racial persecution disguised as law enforcement. The real killer, meanwhile, seemed to feed off the chaos his actions had created. The vigilante activity provided perfect cover for his movements, as Austin streets filled with armed men whose presence no longer seemed unusual or suspicious. He could move through the city with even greater freedom, knowing that attention was focused on the citizens hunting him rather than on careful observation of unusual behavior. The psychological impact of the vigilante period was profound and lasting. Austin's residents began to see enemies everywhere, to interpret every unfamiliar face as a potential threat, and to view violence as the only reliable response to danger. The city's social fabric, already strained by a year of serial murder, began to unravel under the weight of collective paranoia and mistrust. Women who had once moved freely through Austin streets now rarely ventured out alone, regardless of race or social class. The killer had specifically targeted servant girls, but the atmosphere of terror had expanded to encompass everyone. Families installed new locks, acquired weapons, and developed elaborate security routines that transformed daily life into a constant state of defensive preparation. The economic impact was severe as well. Businesses that depended on evening customers saw revenue plummet as people avoided being out after dark. The servant economy that had sustained Austin's domestic life began to collapse as women refused to work in isolated quarters or demanded wages that families couldn't afford to pay. The city that had been growing and prospering was now contracting under the weight of fear and violence. Perhaps most tragically, the vigilante period created a climate where the actual killer could operate with even greater impunity. With armed groups roaming the streets and citizens focused on suspected enemies within their own community, the systematic predator who had started Austin's nightmare was free to continue his work while attention focused elsewhere. The vigilante justice that was supposed to protect Austin from the Servant Girl Annihilator had instead created new victims, new divisions, and new opportunities for the very killer it sought to stop. Austin had become a city at war with itself, and a monster in their midst was winning. December 24th, 1885, exactly 1 year after the Christmas Eve murders that had shattered Austin's sense of safety, the Servant Girl Annihilator returned to complete his reign of terror with a display of savagery that would forever mark him as one of America's most brutal serial killers. The killer had spent months in shadow, allowing Austin's vigilante fury to burn itself out while he planned what would become his masterpiece of destruction. The city had begun to hope that perhaps the monster had finally moved on, died, or been captured elsewhere. That hope died in the pre-dawn hours of December 24th, when Austin discovered that their nightmare was far from over. The first victim was Sue Hancock, a cook who worked for the prominent Moses Hancock family. Sue lived in the familiar arrangement that had proven so vulnerable, a small cabin behind the main house, isolated enough for privacy, but close enough that her screams should have awakened the family. They never got the chance. The killer had refined his approach over the months of inactivity, perfecting methods that ensured silence before terror. Sue's murder demonstrated an evolution in the killer's technique that chilled even experienced investigators. The axe work was more precise than ever before, delivered with surgical accuracy that suggested extensive practice. The signature iron rod was driven through her skull at an angle that indicated not just anatomical knowledge, but genuine expertise in the mechanics of human destruction. This wasn't random violence, it was craftsmanship. But the killer wasn't finished with his Christmas Eve performance. Within hours of Sue's murder, he struck again, claiming Eula Phillips as his second victim of the night. Eula, who worked as a domestic servant for a family on the east side of town, became the 8th confirmed victim of Austin's serial predator, though investigators suspected there were others whose deaths had been attributed to different causes or different killers. The double murder revealed new depths of the killer's planning and execution. He had struck at 2 locations miles apart, suggesting either remarkable speed and local knowledge or possibly the involvement of multiple perpetrators working in coordination. The crime scenes showed the same meticulous attention to his signature methods, but with refinements that spoke to a mind constantly evolving its approach to human destruction. What made the December 24th murders particularly terrifying was evidence that the killer had spent considerable time at each scene. He hadn't simply murdered his victims and fled. He had lingered, apparently savoring his work or possibly conducting some form of ritual whose purpose investigators could only guess at. The extended time at each location suggested a confidence that bordered on arrogance, a killer who felt completely secure in his ability to operate without detection. Dr. Charles Steiner's examination of the bodies revealed details that would haunt Austin's investigators for years. Both women showed signs of having been tortured before death, subjected to violence that went far beyond what was necessary to kill. The killer had taken pleasure in their suffering, prolonging the experience for his own gratification in ways that demonstrated a level of sadism that few human minds could comprehend. The weapon analysis from the December murders showed continued evolution in the killer's arsenal. The axes were different from those used in previous attacks, suggesting either a large collection of tools or the ability to acquire new implements as needed. The iron rods maintained their consistency, sharpened railroad spikes driven with precision that indicated both strength and skill. The timing of the attacks revealed psychological sophistication that elevated the crimes beyond random violence into the realm of calculated terror. By returning on the anniversary of his previous Christmas Eve murders, the killer was making a statement about his permanence in Austin's life. He wanted the city to understand that he hadn't disappeared, that their vigilante efforts had been futile, and that he could strike whenever and wherever he chose. Marshal Grooms, Lee found himself facing not just two new murders, but the collapse of whatever fragile stability Austin had managed to maintain during the killer's period of apparent inactivity. The December 24th attacks reignited the panic that had briefly subsided, sending the city spiraling back into the paranoid chaos that had characterized the worst periods of the terror. The investigation revealed that the killer had used the months between attacks not for rest but for preparation. Evidence suggested he had conducted surveillance of multiple potential targets, studying their routines with the patience of a professional hunter. The precision of his strikes indicated extensive planning and preparation, suggesting a level of organization that made him far more dangerous than investigators had previously understood. The psychological impact of the December murders was devastating. Austin's residents had begun to believe that perhaps the worst was behind them, that their city might finally be healing from the trauma of serial murder. The killer's return shattered that hope and demonstrated his ability to control not just individual victims, but the entire community's emotional state. The December 24th murders would prove to be the Servant Girl Annihilator's final confirmed attacks, though investigators would never be certain whether he had stopped killing or simply gotten better at concealing his crimes. The two women who died that night became the final entries in a catalog of horror that had claimed at least 8 lives and terrorized an entire city for over a year. As Austin entered 1886, its residents faced a terrible uncertainty. Was their tormentor finally finished, or was he simply preparing for even greater horrors to come? The silence that followed the December murders would prove almost as terrifying as the violence that had preceded it, leaving a city forever changed by its encounter with pure evil. As the body count reached 8 confirmed victims, Austin's investigators found themselves drowning in theories, suspects, and false leads that seemed to multiply with each passing day. The Servant Girl Annihilator had created a void of uncertainty that Austin's terrified residents filled with speculation, accusation, and a desperate hunger for answers that often overwhelmed the search for truth. The first serious suspect emerged from Austin's own ranks. Nathan Elgin, a black cook who worked in several of the neighborhoods where attacks had occurred, found himself under intense scrutiny after witnesses reported seeing him near 2 of the crime scenes. Elgin's employment history provided him with detailed knowledge of the domestic arrangements that the killer had exploited so effectively. Under aggressive interrogation, he provided alibis that couldn't be verified, explanations that seemed rehearsed, and displayed a nervousness that investigators interpreted as guilt. The case against Elgin seemed compelling until a more thorough investigation revealed the weakness at its foundation. The witnesses who had placed him near the crime scenes were unreliable, their memories clouded by the paranoia and racial prejudice that had consumed Austin. Elgin's nervousness during questioning was easily explained by the knowledge that black men accused of crimes against women in 1880s Texas rarely lived long enough to see trial. Most damning to the case against him was the timing. Elgin had been working in San Antonio during 2 of the murders, with employment records and witnesses that placed him far from Austin when the killing occurred. The collapse of the Elgin case marked a turning point in the investigation. Marshal Grooms Lee began to realize that Austin's atmosphere of terror was generating more false leads than genuine clues. Every suspicious stranger, every man with a grudge, every individual whose behavior seemed even slightly unusual became a potential suspect in the minds of frightened residents who desperately wanted to believe that the monster among them had a human face they could identify. The most intriguing suspect emerged from an unexpected source, the railroad. James Phillips, a section foreman who maintained track between Austin and San Antonio, possessed both the skills to sharpen railroad spikes into lethal weapons and the mobility to appear and disappear from Austin without maintaining permanent residence. Phillips had been present in Austin during several of the attacks, his work schedule providing a plausible explanation for his presence without creating a definitive alibi for his activities during the crucial overnight hours when the murders occurred. The case against Phillips gained momentum when investigators discovered that he owned multiple axes as part of his professional equipment and had the metalworking skills necessary to modify railroad spikes into the signature weapons found at crime scenes. His work brought him into contact with Austin's domestic arrangements, as he often took meals at homes where servant girls worked, providing opportunities to study potential victims and their routines. But Phillips, like Elgin before him, proved to be another dead end wrapped in circumstantial evidence and desperate hope. His work records showed him in distant locations during key attacks, and his supervisor provided testimony that Phillips was a reliable employee whose whereabouts during work hours were well documented. The case collapsed when investigators realized they were trying to force evidence to fit their suspicions rather than following the facts wherever they led. The failure of these early investigations forced Austin's lawmen to confront an uncomfortable reality. They were dealing with a killer whose intelligence and planning exceeded their ability to predict or trace. The Servant Girl Annihilator wasn't a common criminal whose mistakes would eventually provide the key to his capture. He was something new and terrible, a predator who understood both criminal methodology and investigative procedure well enough to stay consistently ahead of those hunting him. Dr. Charles Steiner, whose medical analysis had provided some of the most useful insights into the killer's methods, offered a psychological profile that painted a disturbing picture. The killer was almost certainly a white man with sufficient social standing to move freely through Austin's neighborhoods without arousing suspicion. His anatomical knowledge suggested either medical training or extensive experience with animal slaughter. His ability to acquire and modify weapons indicated mechanical skills and access to tools and materials. Most chillingly, Dr. Steiner's analysis suggested that the killer derived genuine pleasure from his work. The extended time spent at crime scenes, the torture inflicted before death, and the signature mutilations all pointed towards someone for whom murder was not just a means to an end, but an end in itself. This psychological insight helped explain the killer's pattern of escalation and his apparent indifference to the risk of capture. The investigation also revealed the killer's sophisticated understanding of Austin's social dynamics. By targeting servant girls, he had chosen victims whose deaths would initially generate less intensive investigation and whose social isolation made them easier to approach and attack. His timing demonstrated awareness of family schedules, police patrol patterns, and the rhythms of daily life that governed when his victims would be most vulnerable. As 1886 progressed without new attacks, investigators faced the possibility that their quarry had either died, moved on, or simply gotten better at concealing his crimes. The silence was almost as terrifying as the violence had been, leaving Austin suspended between relief and dread, never knowing whether their nightmare was truly over or simply paused. The suspect, who had briefly offered hope of resolution, instead highlighted the investigation's fundamental weakness. Austin's police lacked the resources, training, and scientific methods necessary to catch a killer of unprecedented sophistication. They were frontier lawmen trying to solve crimes that wouldn't be fully understood until criminal psychology emerged as a discipline decades later. In the end, the hunt for the Servant Girl Annihilator revealed as much about the limitations of 1880s law enforcement as it did about the killer himself. Austin had encountered evil that exceeded their ability to comprehend or combat, leaving them with nothing but questions, theories, and the haunting certainty that somewhere among them, a monster remained free. The killing stopped as suddenly as it had begun. After the December 24th, 1885 murders of Sue Hancock and Eula Phillips, Austin waited in collective terror for the next attack, but it never came. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and still the Servant Girl Annihilator remained silent. The absence of violence became almost as haunting as the carnage that had preceded it, leaving a city forever changed by its encounter with pure evil. By the summer of 1886, Austin's residents began the slow, painful process of returning to normal life. Gas lamps still flickered in the darkness, servant quarters still stood behind grand houses, and domestic workers still walked the same streets where 8 of their number had been brutally murdered. But nothing would ever be the same. The innocence that had characterized Austin's frontier optimism had been sacrificed on the altar of the killer's bloodlust, leaving behind a community that understood, perhaps for the first time, that monsters could walk among them, wearing human faces. The investigation officially remained open, though Marshal Grooms Lee and his small force had long since exhausted their leads and resources. The case files filled an entire cabinet. Witness statements that contradicted each other, suspect descriptions that fit half the men in Texas, and physical evidence that pointed toward a ghost who left only death in his wake. The most sophisticated criminal investigation in Austin's history had produced nothing but frustration and the growing certainty that their quarry possessed intelligence that exceeded their ability to match. The theories about the killer's disappearance were as varied as they were unprovable. Some believed he had died of natural causes or been killed in an unrelated incident, explaining the sudden end to the murders. Others suspected he had moved on to terrorize another city, carrying his methods to new hunting grounds where his previous crimes wouldn't be connected to fresh horrors. The most disturbing possibility was that he had simply gotten better at concealing his work, perfecting techniques that left no trace of his continued presence. What was certain was the lasting impact of his reign of terror on Austin's social fabric. The servant economy that had sustained the city's domestic life never fully recovered. Many black women refused to work in isolated quarters, demanding higher wages that reflected the mortal danger their employment entailed. Families who had relied on domestic help found themselves adjusting to new realities of household management that didn't depend on vulnerable workers living alone in backyard cabins. The racial tensions that the murders had inflamed continued to poison Austin's community relationships long after the killing stopped. The vigilante period had revealed ugly truths about the city's social hierarchy that couldn't be easily forgotten or forgiven. Black residents had learned that their safety was expendable in the face of white fear, while white families had discovered that their comfortable assumptions about contained violence were dangerously naive. The psychological scars ran deeper still. Austin's children grew up hearing whispered stories about the monster who had stalked their streets, learning to fear darkness and strangers in ways that would shape their entire worldview. Women of all races and classes developed habits of hypervigilance that would persist for generations, passing down an inheritance of fear that the killer had embedded in the city's collective unconscious. The case attracted national attention in ways that horrified Austin civic boosters who had worked so hard to promote their city as a beacon of progress and prosperity. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco carried stories about the Austin horror and the Servant Girl murders, branding the Texas capital as a place where savage violence could erupt without warning or resolution. The publicity damage took years to overcome and left lasting impacts on Austin's ability to attract new residents and investment. Law enforcement across the country studied the Austin murders as an example of criminal behavior that challenged existing assumptions about motive, method, and investigation. The killer's systematic approach, signature methodology, and sustained evasion of capture provided a template that would later be recognized as the foundation of serial murder as a distinct criminal phenomenon. The techniques developed during the Austin investigation, crime scene analysis, victim profiling, and geographic pattern recognition, would become standard practices in criminal investigation decades later. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. The most haunting legacy of the Servant Girl Annihilator was the uncertainty that surrounded his fate. Unlike other notorious criminals who were captured, tried, and executed, Austin's monster simply vanished into history, leaving behind only questions and speculation. Some residents claimed to glimpse him in crowded markets, or darkened alleys years after the murders stopped. But these sightings were likely products of traumatized minds that could never quite accept that evil could simply disappear without resolution. Modern criminal investigators who have studied the Austin case believe the Servant Girl Annihilator may have been one of America's first documented serial killers, preceding more famous cases by decades. His sophisticated methods, victim selection criteria, and ability to evade capture demonstrate a level of criminal evolution that wouldn't be seen again until the emergence of killers like Jack the Ripper in London and H.H. Holmes in Chicago. The similarities between the Austin murders and the later Jack the Ripper killings in London have led some researchers to speculate about possible connections between the cases. If you're interested in Jack the Ripper killings case, check our video link in description to learn more about the case. Both killers targeted vulnerable women. Both used signature mutilation methods, and both demonstrated anatomical knowledge that suggested medical training or extensive experience with human anatomy. The timing of the Austin murders ending and the London murders beginning has fueled decades of speculation about whether the same predator might have operated on both continents. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Servant Girl Annihilator is the reminder that evil can emerge from anywhere, strike without warning, and vanish without resolution. Austin's encounter with a serial killer before the term existed revealed the limitations of frontier justice when confronted with sophisticated criminal minds. The city that had prided itself on taming the wilderness discovered that some forms of darkness couldn't be conquered by courage, determination, or even vigilante justice. Today, Austin remembers the Servant Girl Annihilator primarily through historical societies and true crime enthusiasts who keep the story alive in books, articles, and walking tours that trace the killer's path through the city's older neighborhoods. The servant quarters where the murders occurred have long since been demolished, replaced by modern development that has erased most physical traces of the terror. Yet the memory persists, embedded in Austin's collective consciousness like a scar that never quite heals. In a city that has grown from a frontier town of 11,000 to a modern metropolis of over 1 million, the ghost of the Servant Girl Annihilator remains a reminder that monsters can emerge from the most unexpected places, leaving destruction that echoes across generations. The case remains officially unsolved, the killer's identity lost to time and shadow. Somewhere in Austin's past, a predator lived, killed, and disappeared, taking with him the answers to questions that still haunt those who study his crimes. The Servant Girl Annihilator achieved a form of immortality through his brutality, ensuring that his legacy of fear would outlive whatever human form contained such monstrous appetites. Austin survived its encounter with pure evil, but the city that emerged from the shadow of the Servant Girl Annihilator was forever changed, forever wary, and forever marked by the knowledge that some mysteries are too dark to solve and some monsters are too clever to catch.